In the quiet town of Willow Creek, Officer James Carter's routine patrol takes an unexpected turn when he misjudges a scruffy dog as a nuisance, only to discover it's Rusty, the loyal service companion of Thomas Reed, a former firefighter. What begins with a regrettable spray of pepper mist unfolds into a heartwarming journey of redemption as James joins Thomas and Rusty to rescue abused animals and build a sanctuary of second chances. Through their bond, a community finds healing, proving that compassion can transform even the smallest misstep into a legacy of love. This Channel Critters planet is a haven where every paw, claw, and feather tells a story of resilience and hope. Here rescued animals find new purpose alongside people in need, creating bonds that mend broken spirits and inspire kindness across Willow Creek. The sun dipped low over the sleepy town of Willow Creek, casting a golden sheen across the quiet streets. Shadows stretched long and lazy, painting the sidewalks with a soft, warm glow that made everything feel just a little more peaceful. Officer James Carter leaned against the hood of his patrol car, the metal still radiating the day's heat beneath his folded arms. In his right hand he cradled a styrofoam cup of coffee, lukewarm now, its bitter edge dulled by the hours since he'd poured it at the station. He took a slow sip, savoring the stillness of the evening. It had been an uneventful shift so far, just the way he liked it. No speeding tickets to write, no petty disputes to mediate. Just the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place that demanded much from a cop like James. At 42, with a decade on the force under his belt, he'd seen his share of chaos in bigger cities before transferring here 3 years ago. This town was a respite, a place where the biggest crimes were kids sneaking beers by the creek or Mrs. Larson's cat getting stuck in a tree again. James liked the predictability. It gave him space to breathe, to think about the life he'd built with his wife Sarah and their 2 boys back at their modest house on Elm Street. He glanced at his watch, 6:47 p.m. Another hour, and he'd be home for Sarah's meatloaf, the boys' chatter filling the kitchen. But then a sharp bark cut through the quiet, jarring him from his thoughts. James straightened, his brow furrowing as he scanned the street. The sound came again, louder, insistent, echoing from the direction of the town park a block away. He set the coffee cup on the hood, the faintest ripple trembling across its surface, and squinted into the fading light. There, near the edge of the park's gravel path, he spotted it, a scruffy dog, its coat a patchy mess of dirt and matted fur. It paced nervously near a wooden bench, ribs jutting out beneath its thin frame, its tail tucked low. The dog barked again, a high-pitched yip that grated on James's nerves, and he noticed a woman in a floral dress quicken her pace across the street, casting an irritated glance over her shoulder. James sighed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Strays. He'd never had much patience for them. To him, they were nuisances, mangy freeloaders that rummaged through trash cans, scared kids on their bikes, and occasionally bit someone foolish enough to get too close. Willow Creek had its share, and while the local shelter did its best, there were always a few that slipped through the cracks. This one, though, was making a scene. Another bark rang out, and a man pushing a stroller veered off the path, muttering under his breath as he shot the dog a dirty look. James's hand drifted to his belt, fingers brushing the cool metal of the pepper spray clipped there. He'd used it before on a raccoon once, and a snarling mutt that had cornered a delivery guy last summer. It wasn't cruel, he told himself. It was practical. A quick spray and the problem would scamper off, leaving the town's peace intact. That's enough, he muttered, pushing off the car. The gravel crunched under his boots as he strode toward the park, his shadow stretching ahead of him, like a reluctant companion. The air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Larson's garden nearby, sweet counterpoint to the sour twist in his gut. He didn't like dealing with animals. Never had. Growing up, his family had a cat once, a tabby named Whiskers that scratched him when he was 6 and left him wary of anything with fur and claws. Dogs were worse, unpredictable, loud, messy. This one, with its scraggly appearance and restless pacing, was no exception. As he drew closer, the dog turned its head, catching sight of him. Its barking faltered into a soft whimper, and it took a hesitant step back, ears flattening against its skull. Up close, James could see the dirt caked into its fur, the way its spine poked through its skin like a row of jagged pebbles. It looked half-starved, abandoned, forgotten. For a fleeting moment something stirred in him, a flicker of pity maybe, or the memory of his boys begging for a puppy last Christmas, a request he'd shot down without a second thought. But then the dog barked again, sharp and shrill, and that flicker snuffed out like a candle in the wind. "Shoo," James said, his voice firm but not harsh. He raised a hand, waving it toward the trees. "Get out of here." The dog didn't move, just stared at him with wide, glassy eyes, its tail twitching nervously. James's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for a standoff. He unclipped the pepper spray from his belt, the canister cool and heavy in his palm. "Last chance," he warned, though he knew the dog couldn't understand him. He aimed, his thumb pressing the nozzle, and a fine mist hissed out, shimmering briefly in the golden light before it hit the dog's face. The yelp that followed was sharp, piercing, and it sliced through James like a knife. The dog flinched, shaking its head as if trying to fling the sting away, then bolted, its skinny legs churning against the gravel. James lowered the canister, a faint satisfaction settling in his chest. Problem solved. The park would be quiet again. The pedestrians could stroll in peace, and he could finish his shift without another headache. He turned back toward his car, the coffee cup still waiting on the hood, when something caught his eye, a flash of movement in the distance. The dog hadn't run far. It darted toward a shadowy figure beneath a sprawling oak tree, a man in a wheelchair, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. James froze, watching as the dog pressed its head into the man's lap, tail wagging despite the pain. The man leaned, down, his hands gentle as he wiped at the dog's face with a cloth, his voice a faint murmur on the breeze. James's stomach lurched, the satisfaction curdling into something heavy, something like dread. What had he just done? Officer James. Carter stood rooted to the gravel path, the pepper spray still clutched in his hand, its weight suddenly unbearable. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the park in a soft haze, but it did nothing to warm the chill creeping up his spine. The scruffy dog, still trembling from the mist he'd unleashed, hadn't fled into the woods as he'd expected. Instead, it had bolted straight to a man in a wheelchair, parked beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. The dog pressed its head into the man's lap, its tail wagging faintly despite the obvious sting in its eyes. The man, frail and shadowed by the tree's canopy, leaned down, his hands moving with a tenderness that made James's chest tighten. He wiped at the dog's face with a cloth, whispering words too soft to carry, though their soothing cadence floated on the evening breeze. James's boots felt glued to the ground, the crunch of gravel fading into a distant memory. He'd seen plenty in his years on the force, bar fights, car wrecks, tearful confessions, but this was different. The scene unfolding before him wasn't chaos or crime. It was something quieter, something that tugged at a part of him he'd long buried beneath layers of routine and cynicism. The dog's yelp still echoed in his ears, sharp and accusing, and that flicker of satisfaction he'd felt moments ago curdled into a sour knot of unease. What had he done? He took a hesitant step forward, then another, the pepper spray slipping back into its holster as if it burned his fingers. The man looked up as James approached, his face catching the last rays of sunlight. He was older than James had first thought, maybe 60, with deep lines etched into his skin like a map of hard-earned years. His hair was thinning, grey streaked through what remained, and his eyes, clouded with a mix of sorrow and surprise, met James's with an intensity that made him falter. The wheelchair was weathered, its frame scratched and faded, but the man sat with a quiet dignity that belied his frailty. The dog stayed close, nuzzling his hand, its whimpers softening into a low whine. "Hey there," James called out, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat, forcing a steadiness he didn't feel. "Is this your dog?" The question hung in the air, simple yet heavy with the weight of what he'd just done. The man's gaze lingered on James for a moment, then dropped to the dog. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "This is Rusty. He's not a stray. He's my service dog." The words landed like a punch, knocking the breath from James's lungs. Service dog. Not a nuisance, not a threat. A lifeline. He froze, his grip tightening on the holstered spray as shame washed over him in a hot, prickling wave. He'd seen the signs, Rusty's focus, his loyalty, but he'd ignored them, blinded by his own irritation. The realization hit harder than any reprimand from his captain ever could. James opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. The man, Thomas, he'd later learn, kept wiping Rusty's face, his movements slow and deliberate, as if shielding the dog from further harm. Rusty's eyes were red-rimmed, blinking, rapidly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into Thomas's touch, his tail giving a weak wag that spoke of trust James couldn't fathom. I didn't know," James finally managed, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier authority. "Is he okay? Can I help?" He took another step closer, his boots scuffing the gravel, the sound loud in the stillness. Thomas looked up again, his expression softening just enough to ease the sting of James's guilt. "He'll be fine," he said, though there was a tremor in his tone that hinted at more beneath the surface. "It stings, but he's tougher than he looks." He paused, stroking Rusty's head, and the dog let out a shaky breath, settling against Thomas's legs. "Most people don't see him for what he is. They see the scars, the dirt, and assume he's trouble." James felt those words like a mirror held up to his own actions. He'd assumed too, judged Rusty by his rough exterior and barking, "Never," pausing to consider there might be more to the story. He glanced at the dog again, really looking this time. Beneath the matted fur and bony frame, there was a steadiness, a purpose in the way Rusty stayed glued to Thomas's side. Service dog. The phrase echoed in his mind, each repetition sinking the knife of regret a little deeper. "I'm sorry," James said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. He crouched down, bringing himself level with Thomas and Rusty, his knees creaking against the strain. Up close, he saw the weariness in Thomas's frame, the way his hands trembled. Slightly as they worked the cloth, Rusty tilted his head toward James, his eyes still watery but curious, and for a moment James thought he saw forgiveness there, something he didn't deserve. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I thought he was causing trouble." Thomas gave a faint smile tinged with sadness. "He does bark a lot," he admitted, his voice warming slightly. "Gets him in trouble sometimes. But he's not here to make a mess, he's here for me." He rested a hand on Rusty's back and the dog pressed closer, as if anchoring him. "I'm Thomas Reed, by the way." "James Carter," James replied, nodding stiffly. He hesitated, then added, "Officer Carter, technically, but right now I just feel like an idiot." The confession slipped out, raw and unpolished, and Thomas's smile widened just a fraction, enough to ease the tension coiling in James's gut. "Don't beat yourself up too much," Thomas said. "You're not the first to misjudge him. Won't be the last." He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sun had nearly vanished, leaving a streak of orange against the sky. "But there's a story here, if you've got a minute. Might change how you see him and me." James straightened, his curiosity piqued, despite the guilt still gnawing at him. He glanced back at his patrol car, the coffee cup a distant speck, on the hood, then at Thomas and Rusty, their bond radiating a quiet strength he couldn't ignore. "I've got time," he said, settling onto the bench nearby. "Tell me about Rusty." Thomas nodded, his hand never leaving the dog's fur, and as the evening deepened around them, James braced himself for a tale he hadn't expected. One that would unravel his assumptions and leave him reeling with a regret he couldn't yet name. The park was slipping into twilight as Officer James Carter sat on the wooden bench, the rough slats pressing into his thighs. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and jasmine, but it did little to soothe the heat of shame still burning in his chest. Across from him, Thomas Reed sat in his weathered wheelchair, his frail hands resting on Rusty's back. The scruffy dog lay calm now, his head in Thomas's lap, though his red-rimmed eyes still blinked against the lingering sting of the pepper spray. James couldn't look away from those eyes, Glassy, trusting, and far too forgiving for what he'd done. He shifted uncomfortably, the gravel beneath his boots grinding softly, a sound that felt louder in the stillness. "I'm sorry," James said again, his voice low, almost lost in the rustle of the oak leaves overhead. He'd already apologized, but the words kept spilling out, as if repeating them could erase the moment he'd raised that canister. "I should have known better. I didn't think." Thomas's faint smile returned, weathered but warm, like a crack of light through a storm cloud. "You're not the first to miss it, James," he said, his tone steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Rusty doesn't exactly look the part. Most folks see a stray and figure that's all there. Is to him." He scratched behind Rusty's ear, and the dog let out a soft huff, nuzzling closer. "But he's more than that. A lot more." James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his patrol cap dangling between his fingers. "You said there's a story," he prompted, his curiosity outweighing the guilt for a moment. "I'd like to hear it." He needed to hear it. Needed. Something to make sense of the ache twisting inside him. Something to justify the forgiveness he saw in Rusty's gaze. Thomas nodded, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the last sliver of orange was fading into dusk. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the pieces of a tale he'd told himself 1,000 times. "I was a firefighter," he began, his voice rough but clear. 20 years, give or take, stationed a few towns over, back when I could still run into a burning building without a second thought. It was my life saving people, pulling them out of the worst days they'd ever know. Felt like I was invincible. James listened, his own years on the force flickering through his mind. Nights spent breaking up fights, chasing down petty thieves. He knew the weight of a job that demanded you be a shield for others. "What happened?" he asked, though he could guess from the wheelchair the way Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly under an unseen burden. 5 years ago, Thomas said, there was a blaze. Big warehouse fire, old timber, chemicals everywhere. We got the call late, and by the time we rolled up, it was a monster. I went in with my crew, pulled 2 workers out before the roof started groaning. Should have stopped there, but I heard someone else, faint, calling from the back, went in alone." He paused, his hand tightening on Rusty's fur. "Next thing I knew, the whole place came down. Beams, steel, all of it. They dug me out. But my legs, they didn't come with me." The words hung heavy between them, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd seen accidents, hauled people from wreckage, but hearing it from Thomas, quiet, matter-of-fact, yet raw, hit differently. "I'm sorry," he said again, though it felt inadequate now, a flimsy bandage on a wound too deep. Thomas waved it off, a small gesture that carried years of acceptance. "Thought my life was over after that. Everything I'd built, gone. In a flash. Couldn't work. Couldn't walk." The nightmares started too. Fire. Smoke. That sound of the building collapsing. Woke up screaming more nights than I didn't. Doctors gave me pills, friends stopped calling. I was a ghost in my own skin. James glanced at Rusty, who'd lifted his head slightly as if sensing the shift in Thomas's tone. "And Rusty?" he prompted, his voice softer now, drawn into the story like a thread pulling him closer. "Rusty came 2 years later," Thomas said, a flicker of light returning to his eyes. "Found him through a rescue program, some group that trained dogs for folks like me. He was a mess when I met him. Skinny, skittish, scars all over him from God knows what. They said he'd been abandoned, left to fend for himself. Took one look at him and thought, that's me. Broken, scared, nobody betting on us. But something clicked." He paused, stroking Rusty's back, and the dog settled again, his tail thumping faintly against the wheelchair. "He's trained. Fetches. Things, opens doors, helps me get around. But it's more than that. He knows when I'm slipping, when the dark gets too close, sits with me, nudges me, pulls me back. Saved me from myself more times than I can count." Thomas's voice cracked. Just for a second, and he cleared his throat. "He's my lifeline, James. Not just my legs, but my heart." James sat back, the weight of Thomas's words settling over him like a blanket. He'd never thought an animal could mean so much, never seen beyond the barking, the mess, the nuisance he'd pegged Rusty as. But here was this dog, scarred, hands scruffy, holding a man together when everything else had fallen apart. He looked at Rusty again, really looked, and saw the quiet strength in his stillness, the loyalty in his unwavering presence. It was humbling, and it made James's earlier actions feel small, petty, cruel. "I can see why he's special," James said, his voice thick, "and why he's so protective of you. I wish I'd seen it sooner." He reached out, hesitating, then let his hand hover near Rusty. The dog lifted his head, sniffing cautiously, then nudged James's fingers with a damp nose. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, forgiveness he hadn't earned, trust he didn't deserve. Thomas chuckled softly, a sound that broke the tension. "He's got a big heart, bigger than mine sometimes." He met James's gaze, his expression thoughtful. "You're not a bad guy, James. Just made a quick call. Happens to the best of us." James nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. "Anything I can do to make it right?" he asked, genuine now, needing to fix something. "Anything." Thomas pointed toward a nearby water fountain. "There's a collapsible bowl in my bag," he said, gesturing to a pouch on the wheelchair. "Some water might help his eyes." James jumped up, eager for the task, and hurried to fill the bowl. As he returned, watching Rusty lap it up with a grateful wag, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start, that Thomas and Rusty had more to teach him, more to change in him than he could yet imagine. The night had fully settled over Willow Creek by the time Officer James Carter handed Thomas Reed the collapsible bowl of water. The park was quiet now, the golden glow of sunset replaced by the silver shimmer of moonlight filtering through the oak's branches. Rusty lapped at the water eagerly, his tail giving a tentative wag as the sting in his eyes began to ease. James crouched beside him, watching the dog's gentle movements, and felt the knot of guilt in his chest loosen, just a little. Thomas's story still echoed in his mind, a firefighter broken by tragedy, a scruffy dog who'd become his anchor. It was a tale of loss and healing that James couldn't shake, one that made his earlier irritation feel petty and small. "Thanks," Thomas said, his voice soft as he folded the damp cloth and tucked it into his bag. He stroked Rusty's head, the dog leaning into his touch with a contented sigh. "He'll be all right. He's tougher than he looks," James nodded, rising to his feet. "I can see that. And you?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You've been through a lot. Both of you." He glanced at Rusty, then back at Thomas, the weight of their bond settling over him like a revelation. "I misjudged him. Misjudged you both. I'm sorry doesn't cut it, but it's all I've got." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners, a faint smile breaking through the sorrow etched into his face. "Sometimes sorry's just the start," he said. "The best way to make it right is to learn from it. People see Rusty's scars, his rough coat, and write him off. If you can look past that next time, if you can see the value in what others overlook, that's enough for me." The words hit James like a quiet command, resonating deeper than any lecture from his captain ever had. He'd spent years on the force sizing up situations in seconds, threat or no threat, order or chaos. It was how he survived, how he kept the peace. But tonight, that instinct had failed him, blinded him to the truth beneath Rusty's barking. He nodded slowly, a promise forming in the gesture. "I'll remember," he said. "I'll make sure others do too." Thomas tilted his head, studying him for a moment, then glanced toward the far end of the park. "You're wondering why I'm here, aren't you?" he asked, his tone shifting, calm but deliberate. James blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "I guess I am," he admitted, following Thomas's gaze. The park stretched out dark and empty, the benches and paths swallowed by shadows. "Most people don't sit out here this late. Seems isolated." Thomas's lips curled into a wry smile. "I'm waiting for someone." He paused, his hand resting on Rusty's back as the dog perked up, ears twitching. "Someone I've never met." James raised an eyebrow, his cop instincts kicking in. "Family?" "No," Thomas replied, shaking his head. The person who abandoned Rusty. His voice hardened, just enough to hint at the fire that once drove him into burning buildings. It's complicated. A few weeks back, a friend from the shelter where I got Rusty called me. They'd taken in another dog, same build, same scars. Looked so much like him it gave me chills. They dug into it, found out both came from an illegal fighting ring. James's stomach churned, a familiar sickness rising at the thought. He'd busted animal abusers before, backyard breeders, neglect cases, but dog fighting was a different beast, a shadowy world of cruelty he'd only glimpsed in reports. Rusty escaped, he asked, piecing it together. Must have, Thomas said. Broke free during a raid, I reckon. The other dog wasn't so lucky. Found him half dead, malnourished, scared of his own shadow. But he had a collar with an address. Traced it to a place not far from here. Owner was long gone, but word is he's got ties in town. I've been waiting, hoping someone shows up. Someone who knows where he is. James leaned forward, his mind racing. You're looking for answers. More than that, Thomas said, his jaw tightening. I need to know how Rusty ended up in that hell. Why anyone thinks it's okay to treat animals like that. He glanced at Rusty, who'd settled at his feet, eyes still red but alert. He deserves that much. James felt a surge of admiration and a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a man and his dog. It was a mission, a quiet fight for justice. That could be dangerous, he said, his voice cautious. People who run those rings don't mess around. Thomas gave a small, mirthless laugh. Danger doesn't scare me anymore, James. I've faced the worst day of my life. Everything else is just noise. Before James could respond, Rusty's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. James followed his gaze to a figure approaching from the shadows, a man in ragged clothes, his gait hurried and nervous. He stopped a few feet away, eyes darting between Thomas, Rusty, and James's badge. "What do you want here?" the man asked, his voice rough, wary. Thomas straightened in his chair, his tone steady. "Answers. You ran with the people who did this to my dog. I want to know why." The man's face twisted, fear mingling with defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rusty's growl deepened, and James stepped forward, his badge glinting in the moonlight. "Think carefully," James said, his voice firm but calm. "Lying to an officer makes this worse for you." The man hesitated, then muttered, "Fine. I worked for them, okay? But I got out. It's bigger than you think. Dog fights, trafficking, moving animals across state lines. Rusty was probably meant for some rich bastard's bet." He glanced over his shoulder, nervous. "They used a warehouse on the edge of town. Might still be there." James exchanged a glance with Thomas, the air thick with unspoken resolve. "You've done the right thing," he said to the man, his tone edged with steel. "Now get out." "Of here." As the figure scurried off, James turned to Thomas. "What now?" Thomas's eyes gleamed with determination. "We make sure no other dog goes through what Rusty did." James tapped his radio, his heart pounding with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. Need a unit near the old warehouse district. Possible illegal activity. Approach with caution." He looked at Thomas and, "Rusty, the night alive with possibility. You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I'm in." Thomas nodded, gratitude flickering in his gaze, and Rusty barked softly as if sealing the pact. For James, this was more than a case. It was a chance to right a wrong, to see the world through new eyes, and to stand with two souls who'd already changed him forever. The warehouse loomed like a shadow against the night sky, its cracked walls and broken streetlights casting an eerie pall over the edge of Willow Creek. Officer James Carter parked his patrol car a safe distance away, headlights off, the engine's hum fading into silence. Beside him, Thomas Reed sat in the passenger seat, his hands steady on Rusty's fur as the dog perched alertly between them. The tension in the air was thick, but beneath it pulsed a shared resolve, a quiet fire that had ignited the moment James pledged to join their fight. Backup was en route, their radios crackling with updates, but for now it was just the three of them, bound by a mission that felt bigger than any call James had ever answered. "You stay back," James said, his voice firm as he unbuckled his seat belt. He glanced at Thomas's wheelchair, then at Rusty, whose ears twitched at every sound. This could get messy. Thomas smirked, a glint of his old firefighter's grit shining through. I'm not reckless, James, but we're not sitting this out. Rusty's got a nose for trouble, let him help. He handed James a spare police radio, its weight a silent pact. James hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but keep him close. He stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin, and motioned for the backup unit, 2 officers in a second cruiser, to split up and cover the perimeter. Rusty tugged gently at Thomas's chair, guiding him toward a rusted side door the others had overlooked. Found something, Thomas whispered into the radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. James joined him, pushing the door open with a slow creak. Inside, the air was thick with damp concrete and a sharp metallic tang. His flashlight swept the room, revealing rows of cages, some empty, others holding trembling dogs, their eyes wide with fear. Cats and even a few exotic birds huddled in corners, their soft whimpers cutting through the silence. Dispatch, James said into his radio. We've got evidence of animal trafficking. Send animal control and more units, now. The officers moved deeper, hearing muffled voices from an adjacent room. They're on to us, a gruff voice hissed. Move the stock tonight. James signaled for silence, then burst in, weapon drawn. Police. Hands where I can see them. The men froze, but one bolted for a back exit, until Rusty lunged forward, barking fiercely, blocking his path with bared teeth. Down, Rusty, Thomas commanded, with the dog instantly obeying, though his growl lingered. The officers cuffed. The suspects, the room secured in a blur of shouts and clinking metal. James turned to Thomas, breathless but grinning. Your dog's got instincts. Thomas smiled, his eyes glistening. He's been through hell. He knows when something's wrong. As animal control arrived, freeing the creatures from their cages, James watched Thomas and Rusty with a swell of gratitude. This night had changed him, shifted something deep in his core. But it wasn't over. Later, as the last van drove off, Thomas spoke up, his voice resolute. These animals deserve more than rescue. They need healing, like Rusty gave me. What if we built a sanctuary, paired them with people who need them, veterans, kids, seniors? James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. That's ambitious, Thomas. It's a promise, Thomas replied, stroking Rusty's head. I owe him my life. This is the least I can do. The next morning, the sun rose over Thomas's small property, a patch of land with a rundown barn and empty fields. James arrived with a toolbox and dog food, Monica from Animal Welfare trailing behind with a van of rescued dogs. You're serious about this, she said, handing Thomas a clipboard. They deserve a chance, Thomas said, watching Rusty greet a trembling terrier with a gentle wag. The day buzzed with activity, kennels built, fences mended, the dogs settling into their new home. James hammered nails beside Thomas, sweat beading on his brow, and felt a purpose he'd forgotten in years of routine patrols. Weeks later, the shelter thrived. Donations poured in, volunteers multiplied, and James became a fixture, trading his pepper spray for a bag of treats. One afternoon, Monica handed Thomas a proposal. A business consortium wanted to fund a therapy dog wing, inspired by Rusty's story. Looks like you're starting a legacy, James said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. Thomas grinned, watching Rusty play with a group of pups. We all are. The shelter's reach grew, with Rusty visiting schools and hospitals, his scruffy charm melting hearts. One day, at a park adoption event, a boy approached, eyes wide. Is he the dog from the story? He asked James. Sure is, James replied, kneeling beside Rusty. Want to meet him? The boy nodded, petting Rusty with a shy smile. I want to help dogs like him someday. James's heart swelled. You can. Kindness changes everything, one paw at a time. That evening, as the sun dipped low, James stood by the barn, watching families leave with their new pets. Thomas rolled up beside him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. We've come a long way, he said, handing one over. We have, James agreed, his gaze on Rusty, now romping with a litter of puppies. It's amazing what happens when people come together. The shelter had become a beacon. its story spreading beyond Willow Creek, carried by wagging tails and grateful smiles. As night fell, James locked the barn, Rusty trotting over with a wag. He knelt, rubbing the dog's ears. "We did good, didn't we, buddy?" Rusty licked his face, his eyes bright with loyalty and love, the same eyes James had once misjudged. He stood looking at the stars. "We'll keep going," he said, softly. "For every animal that needs a chance and every person who needs to learn what love can do." Back home, Sarah noticed the change in him. Lighter steps, brighter smiles. "What's got you so happy?" she asked over dinner. James grinned, thinking of Rusty and Thomas. "Found something worth fighting for." The shelter's legacy grew, but for James the real victory was in the quiet moments, the laughter of kids with their dogs, the peace in Thomas's eyes, the warmth of a second chance. It started with a mistake, a spray of mist, and ended with a community healed by compassion, one scruffy dog at a time.